In the last section, we had spoken a little bit about the reader interface. Again, the reader interface is one of the most common interfaces you're going to see as you start to look at the standard documentation. We had said that the purpose of this interface was to allow us to put this kind of abstraction around all these different sources of input that might come into our application. And so rather than having all those separate different types, which would mean that we would have to write different functions to read from all those different sources of data, we end up just having to worry about this reader interface. So all of these different sources of input to our application can implement the reader interface, and then we get this very common point of contact with all these different sources of information. Now we looked at this diagram right here, but to give you just a slightly more realistic version of that diagram, we can think of it being something a little bit more like this. So just to be clear, we're saying that every single source of data or source of input that might come into our application is going to be implementing the reader interface. And that's exactly what we just saw around the documentation for that request body thing. So the request body specifically said that it needs to implement the reader interface. So all that code is already put together for us. It's really just an issue of you and I figuring out how to take advantage of that reader interface and how to take the data out of that request body and then somehow do something useful with it. Now the last thing I want to tell you about the reader interface is what it actually is doing behind the scenes, like what the intent of that read function is doing. So here's the documentation for the reader interface. Remember, it said that something to implement the reader interface has to implement the read function that gets called with a byte slice and then returns an integer and an arr object. So I want to give you just a little bit more insight to what this read function right here is supposed to do. Now you and I are not going to have to implement this read function. We are not going to do this. The entire point of all this interface stuff is to say that the request body has already taken care of this work for us. I just want to tell you what the read function does to give you a little bit of insight as to exactly what's going on here, and specifically why we are passing in a byte slice to this thing. Okay, so we're going to pull up a diagram. This one's going to look a little bit crazy, but we'll talk about it and hopefully get a better sense of exactly what this read function is doing. So in this diagram, we've got two big important elements. We've got this thing on the left-hand side, and I've marked it as being the thing that wants to read the body of our request. So this is the thing that wants to see the reader interface. In other words, this is the thing that wants to somehow consume data from the request body or from whatever is implementing the reader interface. So you can kind of think that this is like you and me right here. You and I want to read data out of the request body. So if we were going to make direct access to this read function, you and I would create a byte slice. So we would create a byte slice and we would pass it to the thing that is implementing the reader, which for our application is the request body. Remember, the request body is implementing the reader interface. So you and I create this byte slice, we pass it off to that read function, and then inside of the read function, that function takes the byte slice, it takes its source of data, so basically the raw body response that it got back from Google, and the function takes the data from the raw body of the response and injects it or pushes it into that byte slice. And so remember all that discussion around pointers that we had a little bit ago? We had said that if we pass a slice off to a function, that function can freely modify the slice, and then the original slice, like back in our code world, before we pass it off to the function, the original slice gets modified. And so that's what's really going on behind the scenes, and that kind of explains this read function signature right here. So even though we are passing in this byte slice, and I don't know about you, but if I was going to read for something in like a classic programming language, I would expect to call read and then be returned a byte slice. Something that says, hey, we just read from the data source, here is a byte slice that's coming back that's full of all the data you want to care or you actually care about. But with this function right here, the signature is just a little bit different to kind of work with that whole concept of pointers and whatnot that we spoke about earlier. So again, the thing that wants to consume this data is going to create its own slice. It'll pass it to read. The read function will push some data into the byte slice, and then whoever had called that function, that read function, now has a byte slice that contains some actual data that can make use of. Now, a little bit more about the two return arguments on this thing, or the two return values. The first is an integer, so we return an integer. The integer is kind of interesting because it represents the number of bytes that was read into that slice. And so I don't know exactly in this documentation right here, I don't know, I'm scanning over it right now, but I don't exactly see it off the top of my head. But essentially the integer right here says, hey, here's how many bytes were just read into the slice. And so it's kind of a little kind of error checking, or a little bit of something that says, hey, here's how much data we just shoved into the slice. And then the second return value is an error object that says, oh, okay, well, hey, here's maybe something went wrong, something didn't go quite right. And so again, just to really reiterate the fact here, some of the reason that the read function is so confusing is I feel like in classic programming languages, we would expect to call read and then get back the byte slice. But with the real read function here, we pass in the thing that we want the data to be added to, and then we get back not actual useful data about the data that we just got access to. Instead, we get some kind of like basically statistics that say, hey, here's how much data we just read, and here's an error if one occurred. Okay, so I know that at this point, we're talking about all of this, we're talking about all this read interface stuff. And not only are we kind of talking about interfaces, but we're talking about this read function, blah, blah, blah. And I know it's a lot of confusing stuff, but again, at the end of the day, I ran into a lot of issues understanding what the heck this reader thing was, especially since you run into this reader interface so often in the standard documentation. And so I know that some of this is a little bit confusing, a little bit painful, but I am very purposefully telling you about all this stuff because I know that it is some difficulty that you're going to have down the line when you start writing your own programs. Okay, so I think that basically closes up on all this reader stuff. I think that we've probably got a good idea of what the reader interface's purpose is and what this read function that it expects to see implemented is doing for us. So the last thing I want to do, and the thing that's going to kind of, progress us along with our program, we're going to figure out how to actually make use of the reader interface, or specifically the read function that is implemented on the actual request body. Because remember, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is actually log out the request body. And so we've spent a couple sections kind of dancing around this subject. So let's take a quick break. We're going to come back in the next section and we're going to figure out how to take that request body and actually get it printed out to the command line. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.